Hi everybody, welcome to the Global Human Rights Group monthly discussion hour. Sorry I'm a minute or two late, that's what happens when you sign in on the wrong account. But hopefully you can all see me now. I'm just checking that we're still live on Facebook, in our Facebook group. Yep, that's all working fine, looks like. So we're live on the Global Human Rights Group Facebook page, as well as on Crowdcast and hopefully YouTube as well. So I'd like to ask people who want to participate in the discussion, come join us on Crowdcast. It's super easy to log in and you can add any comments or questions you have there, and it's going to be a nice easy way for us to chat together, because I really want to make sure that this hour is a discussion hour so that we can all join in learning a bit, but also processing a bit together and answering any questions you have. So we're here today to talk about freedom of speech and freedom of expression and what these mean from a human rights perspective. So at the Global Human Rights Group, one of the things that we try to do is to help with public education and awareness and understanding about what human rights mean. So we're going to talk about what is freedom of speech, what does it mean to have free speech, what is freedom of expression, this human right that we hear people talk about, and how do these two relate to each other? Are they the same? We're also going to talk about when can freedoms like freedom of speech and freedom of expression be limited, and in what ways can they be limited? Is the idea of free speech a free rein, or are there some limitations to this, and when do these limitations apply, and who gets to decide? We're also going to, in the context of this, have a look at what is this concept called inciting hatred? So that the idea of inciting hatred, of inciting violence, of inciting discrimination, what are these things and how are they relevant to freedom of expression and to free speech and its practice in our societies? Most importantly, we're going to try and answer any questions you have. So I really welcome you to add your comments and questions as we go along in the chat box in Crowdcast. And I'd love for you to let me know now, what are the questions that you have about these topics, about the concept of freedom of speech and freedom of expression? What are the concerns that you have? I suppose I should start and acknowledge that this has been a really tough week when it comes to these issues, particularly if you're living in the United States, but in many other countries around the world, watching what's happening in the United States, and also countries that have their own problems with freedom of speech and freedom of expression in their own societies, in their own communities. So one of the things that we at the Global Human Rights Group are concerned about is the way in which freedom of speech is being used as a way of inciting violence and inciting hatred and discriminating against what we call groups at risk. So groups which are traditionally marginalized, excluded, discriminated against in our communities. This is something which, as a human rights practitioner, I do not believe falls squarely under freedom of speech. I don't believe that groups under human rights law have free rein to say or do anything under the banner of freedom of speech when doing that is actually inciting hatred and causing harm and discrimination against other people. Now, I'm going to go into the details of the legality behind that. And there is, I want to acknowledge up front, there's quite a bit of difference between what is allowable and what's accepted under US constitutional law, so under the First Amendment to the Constitution in the United States, and what international human rights law says about these issues and these human rights and how we interpret them and understand them. So let's just have a bit of a brainstorm about what are the kinds of things that we want to think about and talk about when we're talking about freedom of speech and freedom of expression. So one of the things that some people have been asking is, are those protests that have been going on in the United States, particularly in Charlottesville, over the course of the weekend just gone, so in the middle of August, for anybody who's watching this a later date, are these allowable under human rights law? Is this kind of thing actually something which is acceptable if we're analysing the situation from a human rights perspective? Perhaps another perspective, some people might be asking, well, if we want to look at things like the alt-right protests, the neo-Nazi protests that have been happening recently in the US, if we want to look at these and critique them and say that they are not in compliance with our concept of freedom of expression, then don't we also need to look at things like the Black Lives Matter protests? And if we are going to label and condemn groups as being hate groups, do we do or say the same thing when it comes to the other side? So is it, as the US President Donald Trump said, a case of there are people doing things on both sides? I'm going to be really clear up front. As a human rights activist, I don't believe that's the case. And we're going to talk a bit about why and how movements like the Black Lives Matter movement differ in terms of how human rights law, how we interpret what their actions are and how compliant they are with international human rights law, from groups such as the neo-Nazi groups that are spreading a much more hateful and discriminatory message. So people may hear that and say, well, that's all very well and good, but isn't the concept of saying Black Lives Matter, isn't that discriminatory? We all know the arguments about all lives matter and those kind of hashtags. So there's a lot of people that say this concept of being politically correct, this idea of everything has to be PC these days, isn't it going a little bit too far? Isn't political correctness getting in the way of saying how we really feel, or why do we always have to be so politically correct about things? That's one side of the coin. The other side is the people who say, well, isn't actually trying to throw political correctness out and saying that it's just these snowflakes who are overly sensitive that are worried about political correctness, isn't this actually blaming political correctness for getting in the way of things that are actually just hatred? Or racism, or a blatant discrimination against other groups. So what should our governments do? What should authorities do in these situations? Where do they draw the line, and how do they draw the line? What about the so-called new media, looking at social media and things, and the situations where we've had recently in other parts of the world, people being banned from liking political posts on Facebook if they're a public servant, if they're employed by the government, they've been instructed to restrict their use of social media when it comes to political issues. Does this get in the way of our free speech? Or what about if we don't have, like in the situation in Australia, there is no Bill of Rights and there are no protections for human rights law within a constitution? How then do we interpret what these things are? So we look to things like the limitations, sorry, the freedoms that are in the Constitution, such as the right to freedom of political speech as a part of the right to participate in politics and governance. So how do these things all play out when we look at human rights? What do you think? What are the questions that you have? What are the things that you would like us to talk about today? What are the questions that you'd like us to be addressing and raising in this discussion hour on free speech and freedom of expression? If you'd like to tell us what your questions are, see if you can stump me, see if you can have things for us to talk about, just add your comments in the chat in Crowdcast. So we've got a really great comment here from Mel from Melbourne. Thanks for joining us, Mel. Great to have you here. And actually, I should say hello to all the other people who are joining us on Crowdcast. I know we have a great crowd. We have some people in New York. Hi, Sarah. I think Simon is joining us from Australia, maybe, if he's still here. And who else do we have? Yeah, there's somebody joining us from Greece. So it's great to see you all here. Thanks so much for joining us. So let me have a look at this question or comment from Mel. So Mel says that on a similar note, so similar note to this whole issue that's happening in the US and all around the world about freedom of expression and free speech, there's a very divisive and repulsive no campaign, as in a campaign to vote or answer no to a survey in Australia against the issue of same-sex marriage. And actually even this concept of, do we call it same-sex marriage or do we call it marriage equality, that itself is something which is subject to concerns and questions and debate about freedom of expression. Because, for example, the journalists at the national broadcasting channel, so the main TV channel that's meant to be the national broadcaster, have been instructed not to use the term marriage equality, which for many human rights advocates, same-sex marriage advocates, etc., is the more PC term. So they've been instructed not to use the term marriage equality because that gives a particular pejorative perspective on the issue. But they've been instructed rather that they're only allowed to call it same-sex marriage. So what does that say and mean in terms of free speech? So Mel is asking, what would be your take from a human rights framework on the No campaign and the damage it is doing? How do we limit the damage? That's a really excellent question, Mel. Thanks so much for that. So this relates, it really does relate to the whole issue of freedom of speech and freedom of expression. And what I mean when I say that there's a difference between this and what we call, and the ways in which these rights are limited because of concepts such as the concept of inciting hatred and inciting discrimination. So let's take a first step, and we are going to get to answering this question in quite a bit more detail, but let's take a first step to say, well, where does this concept of free speech and freedom of expression come from? Are they the same thing? So they're usually used pretty synonymously, but if we want to have a look at it, the concept of free speech, the actual phrase, it is used in international human rights law, in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, in the preamble to the Declaration, which is the part of the Declaration where it sets up all the bases for these human rights that we have. So it talks about, sorry, one second, I'll find it in my notes here. Yeah, that where we have inherent dignity and equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family, that this is the foundation for justice and peace in the world, and that as part of that, it's essential to protect human rights through the rule of law, and that in this world in which human rights exist, we shall enjoy freedom of speech and belief and freedom from fear and want, and that these things have been proclaimed as the highest aspiration of the common people. So I think these words are really interesting. You know, there's harkbacks there to the Declaration of Independence, to the Magna Carta, all those kind of things. But when we get to the actual substance of human rights law, to the main operative provisions of the Universal Declaration and different human rights treaties, we don't see this language of freedom of speech anymore. We see the language of freedom of expression. So everybody being entitled to all of these rights and being able to have these rights, including the right to freedom of opinion and expression, and how this right includes freedom to hold opinions without interference and to seek and receive and impart information and ideas, including through media. So this concept of freedom of expression is always really closely linked to the media as well, because that's one of the ways in which we express ourselves and we receive information. So the ability to express ourselves is not just about us doing the expression, but also receiving information in order to form our own opinions. So this is a really essential part of international human rights law, but where we have a divergence is in the way that US constitutional law has been interpreted with the freedom of speech and freedom of expression under international human rights law, which contains a lot more limitations and a stronger, well, not a stronger, but a different framework in terms of what this means when it comes to interfering with the rights of others. This has caused us some controversy when we're looking at things in the US from a civil rights perspective as opposed to a human rights perspective, because we see things like organizations that I know many of you have been supporting and donating money to, like the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, who have this really strong support for the First Amendment of the US Constitution, freedom of speech, no matter who it's for. So there's been some controversies this recent week over, should we be supporting the ACLU if they support the rights of these neo-Nazi groups to be speaking on issues which do cause such hatred and discrimination. And this was tested a while ago, or it was again in the media a while ago when we were looking at the issue of Milo Yiannopoulos, who was the editor of the far-right website Breitbart, and he was scheduled to talk at Berkeley University. Some of you may remember this, and it was cancelled because of violent protest. And the ACLU actually stood up for his rights and went to court to ensure that his First Amendment rights to be able to speak were being protected. And at the time, the ACLU said that his words may be hateful in nature, but he still has a freedom to speak about these things. And the concept that the phrase hate speech is itself a form of free speech. Now, in international human rights law, we don't have this concept of free speech being absolute. And if you think about it from what's the commonly used example when it comes to freedom of speech, when we're thinking about should it be limited at all, we often use this example of, well, what if we shout fire in a crowded theatre and there's no fire? Shouldn't that be punished? Well, and we say yes, that should be punished, because why? Because it's causing harm for people. It may cause a stampede, people may be physically injured, it causes fear. In a sense, if we look at the definition of terrorism, about instilling fear in people, that concept of shouting fire in a crowded theatre may even in certain circumstances align itself with what terrorism is trying to achieve. So we have this freedom to impart and to receive information, but there are legitimate restrictions on how we can do this. For example, our governments have restrictions on military secrets and things that are important for our national safety and security. So we have those kind of restrictions. We also have restrictions from a privacy perspective. So just because somebody is a celebrity, does it mean that all of their private photos should be shareable on social media or in the international media? What about the revenge porn sites where people's personal photos are being shared? How does this impact upon people's right to privacy? So one person's right to speak can have a negative impact upon other people, on other rights, or even the right to free speech of other people. So where does this leave us from a human rights perspective? Can we even talk about human rights in this circumstance, or does it become too difficult? Is it really not a right if you have all these limitations and restrictions, or if you're kind of giving with one hand and taking away with the other? We say that the human rights framework does apply, and that that these restrictions are actually important to make sure that we can all enjoy all of our different human rights. So we have this idea that human rights is about balance. It's about balancing what do we mean by freedom of expression with the need to have these legitimate restrictions to protect our personal privacy, our personal safety, the safety of our communities, national security, and all these kinds of things. And that doesn't mean that it dilutes the value of these things from a human rights perspective. So, in international human rights law, we have the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. This is the major treaty, or one of the major treaties, that actually sets out what the concept of the freedom of expression is. And that same time that it sets out what is freedom of expression, it also sets up some limitations. So what are these? You can only limit freedom of expression if you have what's called a legitimate aim. So it's only permissible, it's only allowed to limit freedom of expression if you're doing this to protect the rights and reputations of others, public order, what they call public morals, and national security. There also has to be a basis in law that what they say is what's sufficient quality. So the law has to be clear enough for people to really understand and regulate their own conduct. So for example, you can't just introduce a law after the fact and say, well, that should have not been disallowed, so we're going to disallow it, because people need to know upfront in advance, in clear terms, where and how the law applies to them so that they can understand how they should behave and so they can conduct themselves in a way that's compliant with law. So the authorities can't exceed their discretion that they have here. There may be some margin of appreciation or some kind of discretion that's given to the government, but the government can't exceed what's reasonable in these circumstances. Or how we talk about it in law is talking about what's necessary and proportionate. So this is the other criteria, that freedom of expression can only be limited in ways that are necessary and proportionate. So let's have a think about what is necessary and proportionate. Well, times of terrorist attacks, times when actual national security is being threatened, when what we say in law that there's this overriding public interest in the expression and the limitation that we can actually limit these rights. So not just the freedom of expression, but also the right to public assembly, so the right to assembly, freedom of association. Times when there's this overriding concern about public interest, we can limit these rights. So, for example, that's what gives the municipal authorities the ability to disperse the protests. So when the tanks came in and the trucks came in to block off streets and over the loudspeakers tell people to disperse and stop protesting because the protest was no longer legal, that's one of the bases upon which that concept comes from, the idea that when it's threatening the public order, we can withdraw or limit this concept of freedom of expression. We can't ever completely limit it, but we can restrict it and pull it back to ensure that it doesn't infringe upon other rights like public order, public safety, and our own privacy rights and things. There's another aspect in here which is really important as well, and that is the way in which freedom of expression can extend so far as to involve criminal liability. So when we're doing something which actually constitutes incitement to discrimination or incitement to hostility or violence, international law says that under Article 20 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, it says that these actually are things that state parties actually must prohibit by law. So they're obliged to limit freedom of expression when it comes to, for example, propaganda for war. And what it says is an advocacy of national, racial, or religious hatred that constitutes incitement to discrimination, hostility, or violence. So that's what the law says. That under international human rights law, which may not be fully applied in all of our different countries, and that's a reason why we use the United Nations system to say our full rights under international human rights law have not been complied with in our country, either because the laws are insufficient or they just haven't been put in practice. International human rights law says that freedom of expression is something that we can limit, and it says that freedom of expression is something that governments actually must limit when it comes to national, racial, or religious hatred and incitement to discrimination, hostility, or violence. So what this means is this concept of inciting hatred, it is not just a phrase, not under international human rights law. And if we have governments like the US government that have ratified the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, then they have a legal obligation that is something that the international community certainly looks to them to be upholding, and individual citizens within the country can look to their government to uphold. They have this obligation to make sure that freedom of expression is, first of all, not a completely unfettered, free-for-all right of free speech under any circumstance whatsoever, but also that it can only be limited in certain circumstances, but that it must be limited when we're looking at issues to do with incitement of hatred and discrimination. So again, we're looking at this idea of, is there a legitimate aim when we are trying to interfere with this freedom, if we do interfere? And is it set out in a clear and easily accessible law so that we can understand what's acceptable, what's not acceptable? And is this interference with our freedom of expression, our free speech, is it proportionate to some kind of legitimate aim or necessity that we have in order to maintain our democratic society. So let's go back to this question that Mel posed. So that's a really long-winded way of getting there. Sorry, Mel. But let's go back to this question that Mel posed. What do we think from a human rights perspective? Now that we know that's what the human rights framework is, what do we think from a human rights perspective would be the answer if we say that we have a country, and in this instance, country being Australia, where there's currently a politically divisive issue going on, an issue that divides a lot of society about same-sex marriage, marriage equality, whatever you want to call it. And at the moment, there's what the government is calling a plebiscite, or what is actually in reality a survey of every resident in the country, of everybody who's enrolled to vote. So not every resident, but everybody who's enrolled to vote. It's difficult to explain who it's for because it's not every resident and it's not every citizen. But it's everybody who's enrolled to vote in a normal federal election in the country is being surveyed on, do they want to have laws that allow for same-sex marriage, or do they not want this? Now, in this context, there's been a lot of political lobbying, a lot of public awareness campaigns, a lot of public advocacy campaigns, which have been hurtful, to be really frank, and to be kind of the least possibly controversial I could be on that. A lot of the campaigning from the No campaign to encourage people to vote no against marriage equality has been extremely painful for many people who are members of the LGBTIQA community or allies, or who just believe that marriage equality is not a big deal and should be put in place. So how do we analyze this from a human rights framework? Should everybody be allowed free speech and be able to say and do whatever they want when it comes to this campaign for marriage equality? Or how can we limit the damage on this? How could we take a human rights framework and say, well, actually, maybe we do need to limit this in some ways? So we can limit freedom of expression under international human rights law, and keeping in mind that in this instance, Australia, it has ratified the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. So they are subject to these laws, they've agreed to these laws. So we can limit it if there's a legitimate aim to the interference. So is protecting, you can think about this from the both sides that are going to be used in the political debate. Do we need to protect people from speech that's going to hurt them? Or is this just the PC whinings of a bunch of snowflakes that we need to try and be overly nice and compassionate and caring when it's actually stopping us from saying what we really feel? So is there a legitimate aim to this interference? Well, let's go back to the law. The law says that the government has to restrict freedom of expression and kind of make it safer for when it's causing hurt if it's advocacy of national, racial, or religious hatred, and it constitutes incitement to discrimination, hostility, or violence. Now, as I hope most of you know, in the law, there's never a black or white, or hardly ever black or white clear answer without the grey, well, one person's got this opinion, another person has this opinion. But when I read these things, I think about incitement to discrimination. We know that under international human rights law, we have acknowledged and accepted that a valid ground of discrimination is your sexual orientation or gender identity. Then inciting discrimination and hostility or violence against a group that's discriminated against on the basis of their sexual orientation or gender identity, that's something that our governments do have an obligation to protect us against and to limit freedom of expression in order that it doesn't incite further discrimination, hostility, or violence. So that's one way of looking at it. Keeping in mind, we all have different ways of looking at these things, and even lawyers who are human rights advocates will give different interpretations to these things. But this is what I mean by using a human rights framework. It's not that there's never a clear answer, but some of these issues that we're looking at and dealing with right now, the reason why they're controversial is because they haven't been tested yet, or because we have divergent opinions even within lawyers and judges and courts and things like that. So what I'm trying to give you is an understanding about what the human rights framework says and ways that we can argue or advocate or think about this to challenge our thinking and the thinking of those around us from a different perspective. So if we're looking at the limitations on rights, we looked at the first one, legitimate, is there a legitimate aim? Remember, if we were to say, okay, the campaign that is against marriage equality has to limit itself to ensure that it's not infringing upon anybody, it's not discriminating or inciting discrimination or hatred or violence, then that has to be made really clear in the law so that the people who are acting, who are involved in the politics, who are involved in advocacy, they know exactly where their conduct lies. So that's one of the requirements. If we're going to limit freedom of expression, we have to do this by law, and has to be really clear and obvious what we're doing and what we're saying and where we draw those lines. We also have to think about this issue of proportionality and necessity. So is it proportionate to what we're trying to do? So is our aim protecting this group that may be hurt, or is our aim getting an answer to the plebiscite question of, do we want same-sex marriage? Is restricting that freedom of expression, is it legitimate? Is it proportionate in order to get that end goal? And is it necessary in a democratic society? And this is where the Australian government has been, and many politicians have been quite clear in saying that they don't think that the Australian people need guidance on this. They don't think it needs to be prescribed by law, that you shouldn't be inciting hatred, inciting violence, inciting discrimination. And in fact, Australia already has, I'm not sure I would say quite strong, but it certainly has in existence, laws that prevent racial vilification and things like that. Does it have a law that prevents discrimination or vilification of LGBTI people? No. But does that fall within the anti-discrimination laws in the country? Well, yes, probably. So again, it's a really complicated answer to kind of think of, and we're going to have to pick a discriminated group just because it falls under this banner of free speech. Is that actually part of what I consider to be respecting human dignity? For me personally, and as a human rights lawyer looking at the human rights framework, I say no to those kind of issues. So when we're looking at the so-called neo-Nazi alt-right protests in the US, we think about freedom of speech under the US Constitution. And what I've been saying is that this is important and it's valid and it's one way that we look at it. And if you are a lawyer in the US under the decisions of the US Supreme Court, you say that the US Constitution is the overriding instrument that you look to. For many of us international human rights lawyers, we say, actually, we should be looking to international human rights law because governments like the government of the United States have, through their involvement in the international community, through their involvement in making international human rights law, as an expression of their sovereignty and consent, they have agreed to implement international human rights law within their countries. And international human rights law says that this concept of freedom of expression is not unfettered, that it does have these limitations. So let's have a look at this in more detail. And is the US the only country that has this problem? We see in most of the regional human rights mechanisms, so the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, the European, certainly under the European Convention on Human Rights and the European Court, this concept of freedom of expression exists with limitations. Almost always the very similar or the same limitations as we have under international human rights law. So this idea that we have to think about how we respect the rights and reputations of others. We have to think about public order, national security, or public health and morals. And how can we make sure that freedom of expression is balanced against protecting these things? So we see that quite generally around the world that we have these instances such as public emergencies being things that can justify either what's called in law derogating from the freedom of expression and the way that individuals in society can enjoy that right, or limiting the application of the right, sometimes just temporarily, sometimes permanently, depending on the situation and depending on what the legitimate aim that you're trying to pursue is. So the reason why we do this is because we say that freedom of expression as a concept has to be understood against this background of the prohibitions of abusive invocation of rights and incitement to hatred. This is not just human rights law that says this, actually, but it's actually also international criminal law that says this, because it's actually an international crime to incite hatred. So this is something where, and we have seen in the past, for example, in judgments of the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda that looked at issues to do with crimes against humanity and said that radio stations that were propagating slogans and chants and inflaming the hatred and fomenting violence against the Tutsis in Rwanda and the Hutu opponents, this was incitement to hatred, and this was declared to actually be a crime against humanity. So the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda found the people operating the radio station, they found them guilty of genocide, conspiracy, and incitement to commit genocide and crimes of persecution and extermination just because of what they said on the radio. Now, I say just because, in fact, the whole point was this concept of actually spreading hatred, spreading the idea that violence is a solution. This kind of thing has such a power that it's seen as being so serious that it's been elevated to the level of a crime against humanity and an international crime that can be prosecuted in the international criminal tribunals and international criminal courts. So this is a really interesting aspect to think of this, that it's not just international human rights law that says, oh, it would be really nice if we didn't treat each other like this, if we didn't say these things because it hurts my feelings. In international law, it's actually a crime. So freedom of expression as a concept and freedom of speech, they exist, but they have to have these restrictions, not just on how we do them, so about making sure that it's necessary and proportionate, but we also have restrictions on what we can say, so the content of what we say, and through exercising our freedom of expression. So, for example, national courts can limit what we say. They can have a judgment that says sharing information about this issue is going to be contrary to national security, and we need to restrain this information and restrain people from talking about it, including journalists. And as long as that's really clear, then what's happened in in regional human rights systems, like under the European Convention on Human Rights, the European courts have said, well, we need to look at how is the government attempting to justify this and what have the courts said, and we do give a margin of appreciation to each national government to determine for itself what is appropriate to be limited and what isn't appropriate. So the European Court has actually said that if we are saying under law, okay, we're going to limit freedom of expression, we still have to think about these issues to do with, is it necessary to do this in a democratic society? Is it in the interest of national security? Does it have to do with public safety or territorial integrity? Is it to prevent disorder or crime? Is it there to protect our health or morals? Is it for the protection of the reputational rights of other people? So is it about this issue of privacy? So let's take these things and put that framework that we can think about on the situation that we saw in the US with the neo-Nazi and alt-right protests. One of the questions that I kind of raised as a bit of a piece for food for thought was, would these same kind of protests happen in Europe or elsewhere? What do you all think? If we look at this human rights framework and if we look at these concepts like we are entitled to limit the freedom of expression, to protect public safety, to prevent disorder or crime, to protect the rights of others, and we think about those aspects such as international criminal law prohibits inciting hatred, inciting violence. These is the basis upon which most countries in Europe say, actually, no, there's limits to when and how we can protest. In general, we enjoy freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, freedom of association, but there are limits to it. And not only that, but there are particular laws in place, particularly in countries like Germany and Austria, which really address the issue of the use of Nazi symbols, making a Nazi salute and things like that. And these things are illegal under national law in many European countries. Why is that? Because as societies, as communities, they've decided that these kind of things so debase what the concept of freedom of expression is to that society that they don't want to allow it, that they want to criminalize such activity. So the very short answer to the question of would those kind of protests that happened in the US over this weekend just gone in the middle of August 2017, would they happen in Europe? Well, they may happen, but people would get arrested, and it would not just for being in fights with other protesters, not for actual violence or actual crime, but they would be arrested because what they are doing is inciting hatred. So this is some of the difference between the legal systems that we have and the ways in which we understand freedom of speech and freedom of expression in our different countries, and the ways in which international human rights law has been interpreted and applied in these different countries. So I'm just going to take one quick second and have a look at our Facebook chat to see if there have been any comments or questions there. And I encourage you all to add comments or questions there. It's in fact cut me off there and it said that the video has ended, so that's interesting. I hope that people on Facebook Live got to see as much as they could or as much as they wanted to. We're still live on Crowdcast, which is great. So I'm really pleased to see that Mel says that this has helped her wrestle her thoughts a little bit easier. And as I said, I don't think there is a really clear answer on this. And I know that that's a really typical lawyer's cop-out, that, oh, it's not a black and white issue. It's difficult to say. But the reality is some of these issues that we're grappling with as society are so on the edge of what we've previously thought about and how we understand what's acceptable in society and what isn't acceptable, that there are massive divergences in opinions and in opinions about how we interpret the laws and the frameworks that we've set out to say this is how our society functions. I mean, we see that very clearly in the US, where this concept of what is acceptable in a society is being challenged right now and in a really confronting manner. So Sarah adds a really interesting comment here. Sarah says that from New York, says it definitely does seem to be a cultural difference between the US and Europe that informs how domestic law is shaped in terms of human rights. And that's absolutely true. You know, our governments have got together and agreed on these human rights laws, which are legal laws. They're not just aspirations or goals. But in doing so, sometimes they've made them deliberately nebulous or deliberately vague, but sometimes they're just ignoring the fact that they are quite explicit when it comes to applying these at the national level. And why is this? Well, because it's one thing to say in an international context, yes, we agree, we like this concept of human rights, we want them to be there. And it's another thing to go back to your constituents, to the people in your country that hold really more myopic, more closed-minded views in some instances, or more community-minded views in terms of what your actual community is there, and say, no, we don't want these values or these ideals that have been brought to us from overseas, from the international community. That's some of the arguments on the other side. Of course, some of the counter-arguments to that are actually, our governments have all participated in making these laws, so they should apply them domestically so that we can all enjoy them as well. So I diverged myself as I was reading Sarah's comment. Sarah goes on to say, I think there's more willingness to acknowledge the rights of communities to be protected from inciting hatred. She was saying there about the cultural difference between the US and Europe, saying that in Europe, there's a more willingness to acknowledge the rights of communities to be protected from inciting hatred. And that's a great way of describing it, Sarah. I would say that that's exactly the main difference that I see as well. So Sarah says, whereas the US law and culture seems to be more focused on individual rights. And I'd add there more, I don't want to say obsessed, that sounds quite pejorative, but more focused on the constitutional rights under the First Amendment of free speech, and this idea that free speech is unlimited, that free speech includes the right to hate speech, that hate speech is a form of free speech. Whereas in Europe, taking a human rights-based approach and in applying international human rights law, they look at free speech and what is called in Europe freedom of expression more commonly, and they look at that and say, well, freedom of expression does not include hate speech. In fact, hate speech is a crime. It's a criminal way of speaking, and not because of exactly what you say and how you say it, but because of the consequences, because of the impact it has in terms of the way that it incites other people to hate as well. So there's this idea that there's a danger in how we speak as individuals in terms of the impact it has on the community. And that's coming from a different cultural perspective, maybe differently minded in terms of community priorities, whereas in the US, it is very much based on the individual rights of free speech, which isn't as limited. So let me go back to my notes. And so thank you, Sarah. That was a really good point. I think, you know, in essence, that's what it comes down to. But it's not, I think there's lots of complexities to it as well. So let's just also have a think about when else can freedom of expression in terms of content be limited. It could be limited in terms of how, when we're interfering with that right to privacy, or when we're causing harm to others, not just in terms of their human rights from that, you know, touchy-feely human rights perspective, but also when what we do or say in terms of our expressing ourselves actually is criminal under the law because of the way in which it defames or libels somebody else. So this is where we see kind of the free speech cases like the one going on at the moment in the US, which the ACLU is involved in, with John Oliver being sued by a businessman for saying on last week's, oh my God, I can't remember the name of his show right now, mental blank. I hope you all know what I mean. But on John Oliver's show, he was doing an expose about particular aspects of one industry. He was speaking about one of the main businessmen in that industry, and he said, "Eat shit, Bob," the name of the guy. Now, there's now a court case where Bob is bringing a defamation libel suit against John Oliver. So the question is John Oliver just exercising his right to free speech? Or is there still, even in the US, is there a balance to be made between free speech and infringing upon somebody else's right, like the right not to be defamed? And in the European law, what the courts have done is actually look at this and said, well, there's aspects to be weighed in terms of, is it in the interest of open discussion to do this? So particularly if you're talking about saying things, the media saying things against journalists, journalists in the media saying things against politicians that may be hurtful or attacking towards politicians. The European courts have said, well, these are people that put themselves in the public realm. They're actually part of the democratic system. They should be, there should be allowable criticism, but there also should be limits to this acceptable criticism. But the limits on acceptable criticism when it comes to politicians acting in their public capacity versus a private individual, these limitations are less. Our scope is a lot broader in terms of the ability for media and journalists to say things without it being against the law when it comes to politicians and people acting in their public capacity. So this is some of the ways in which we see this balance always really needs to be made. And this again comes back to some of the issues that I highlighted about some things to think about in this context being, oh, sorry, Mel has given me the name of the show Last Week Tonight, of course. Thank you, John Oliver's show Last Week Tonight. Sometimes my brain just completely stops and gives a little blank over these things. So thanks, Mel. One of the other ways that we see this playing out in the current issues that are going on in the world is coming back to that example of Australia. And in Australia, journalists at the national broadcaster have been told that they can't be liking Facebook posts that are political. So again, how does this address the balance between freedom of expression and the ability to participate in political life, the ability to have political free speech, and the need for, or the ability of the government to restrict free speech and to determine and to put limitations on what people say and do if they're appearing in the public eye. Now, just to be really clear on this, the restrictions on what journalists at the Australian Broadcasting Corporation could say and do was not put on them by the government, it was put on them by their own organisation, but as it's a government funded national broadcaster, there's issues there about really, is it the government or is it an agency of the government, etc. One of the other things that has happened recently in Australia, if we're kind of scanning the news for what are some of the controversial issues when it comes to freedom of speech and freedom of expression at the moment, is that public servants in Australia have been told not to be liking Facebook posts. So this also, where's the balance here between freedom of speech and these other freedoms like the right to participate in public discourse, express your own opinions, etc. So we have these balance also between looking at who's doing the speaking and who's being the recipient of the information that we're receiving. Does this change? When do we have free speech? When do we not have free speech? Do we have a positive obligation as a public authority to limit what we say? Or when we're talking about a public authority, do we have a wider scope for what we can say? So these are some of the interesting complications when it comes to freedom of speech. Let me see, what else do I have in my notes here that I wanted to talk to you about, since it doesn't seem to be any more questions right now, which is fine, because I know this issue is really complicated and there are lots of different aspects to it. So, sorry, just checking through my notes here. One of the other big issues that we see happening at the moment around freedom of speech, freedom of expression, is the role of social media and cyberstalking, online harassment, bullying, etc. How do we balance that with free speech and freedom of expression? So do we take that human rights framework where we say actually infringe upon the rights of others if it constitutes inciting hatred, inciting discrimination, inciting violence? Is that something which we want to use as a framework to restrict free speech on the internet? And if so, how do we do it? How do we fix problems like online harassment, cyberbullying and things? Because these are really serious threats. It is about inciting violence and hatred in many circumstances. How do we balance that against free speech? Or how do these things threaten free speech? Because it's not just how do we balance it, but for example, as a woman on the internet, how do I enjoy my right to free speech or freedom of expression if every time I do that, or every time I say something controversial, the responses that I get are violent, discriminatory, and or inciting hatred? How can we do that? Now, we spoke a bit about the concept of when we're protesting, would protests like what's happening in the US be allowed to happen in other places? In Europe, we have this concept of actually some protests are restricted because of the way in which freedom of expression, freedom of association can be restricted in order to protect these other rights and to protect the concept of preventing disorder or crime, protecting health, protecting integrity or public safety, protecting the rights of others, that kind of thing. So these are things which we might want to have a think about. Does this actually help us in understanding how should we be looking at some of these protests? Now, I want to take that back to the original question I asked about, does this mean that if we want to restrict the neo-Nazi protests, the alt-right protests, shouldn't we also be restricting Black Lives Matter protests? the Women's March that happened in DC at the beginning of the year, or other things like this? I say no. In my opinion, no. The reason why, and actually there are a number of organizations that agree with me on this issue about the distinction between the two, that is, Black Lives Matter is not a movement that incites hatred. It is not a hate group. Its philosophy, what it's espousing, is that Black lives matter. Not that non-Black people should be punished, should be hurt, should be discriminated against. It's a positive affirmation in about protecting and ensuring the rights of one group. Contrary to some people's opinions, in my view, and the view of many others, it's not about pushing down the rights or doing away with or interfering with the rights of another group at the expense of one group. So it's not about interfering with the rights of non-Black lives for the benefit of promoting Black lives. It's not an anti-Black lives hatred campaign, as opposed to neo-Nazis, the alt-right movement, who have been out talking about the supremacy of white people and the need to get rid of or genocide or do all sorts of horrible things against other groups that don't fall into that category. So I hope, I'm sure actually people who have sat through an hour's worth of a discussion from the Global Human Rights Group about a human rights framework are probably of the same mind on this, but I hope that helps to give you some ways of talking about it and explaining it to other people in your communities to help raise public awareness and understanding about what the difference is between groups that incite hatred and are hate groups and those that don't. When we do have the right to free speech and freedom of expression, how we get these, where these come from, what laws they're protected in, and also how complete are they? When do we have limitations on them? When and how and why philosophically do these limitations exist? And why do those philosophical differences in our communities and our societies make it difficult to find a really clear-cut answer that's the same across the board in terms of how do we interpret these human rights that we have into our national laws and into the policies and practices that we all support in the ways in which our local communities operate. So that's it from me on freedom of speech and freedom of expression today, rights and limitations. I want to thank you all so much for watching and participating, particularly a big shout out to Mel and Sarah, who've been so active and asked questions and made comments. I really appreciate it. And I hope you'll all join us again in a month for our next Global Human Rights Discussion Hour. Thanks so much, everybody. Bye.